I'm just going to give you all a little bit of an update before I start. I'm currently in the process of making scripts for 2 co-op reviews in my Sean's Network Reviews series, and I decided to hold on for a second before I do my top 10 favorite Unikitty episodes list, since I want to take my time and I do want to get people to look at that script before I start production on the actual video, since I want to see if I could explain things a little more, or add some more things to some of my entries on that list. I decided to release my worst list without having people look at the script as a test to see if people would be interested in checking the script for the best list or not. As of right now, I'm not finished with the script for the best list yet, but once I do get the motivation to finish it, I'll send the script to some people so they could check it. As for Sean's Network Reviews, I have quite a bit of episodes in the works. I decided to delay the reviews that I said that I would do on Thundercats Roar and Ollie's Pack, since I haven't watched enough episodes of those shows to get enough of a good grasp on why I think that they don't work. But other shows I do have plans to review. 2 of them, which are co-op reviews with Supersonic Ward 15 and The Gem of 99, are both on Making Fiends and Robot Boy. Making Fiends with Sonic Ward, and Robot Boy with Gem. Both of these reviews are going to take a little bit of time in the scripting phase, since co-ops on anything usually relies on chemistry to make them work. And giving quick thoughts right now, one of these shows I feel mixed on, while the other has so many problems that I'm speculating that my co-op with Gem will come out after the co-op with Ward on Making Fiends. I also have plans on reviewing Puka, a show that holds up very well after remembering watching the show a lot when I was little, that I decided to rewatch a dozen episodes of. And also Kuku Harajuku, a show that I avoided like the plague after I watched one half-hour episode in 2016, due to how unwatchable I think the animation is. And going back and watching a dozen episodes with sunglasses on more recently, the show was much worse than I originally thought it was. And not only that, but on Memorial Day weekend of this year, me and my family members are going to be extremely busy, and that statement depends on when this video in particular comes out. So I decided to pick something easy to make a video about, and luckily in the palm of my hands, I found something very easy to talk about in a solo video. And I say this because the show that I'm talking about today, Kamp Koral, while I don't like the show, it's very easy to talk about because there's not much to really talk about with this show. I am technically late with the first impressions video, considering the fact that the show's first few episodes premiered in March of this year, while at the moment it's the middle of May at the time that I'm writing this script. But there are only 6 episodes of Kamp Koral so far, and just getting this right out of the way before starting this review, while I don't think that this show is good, I actually think that this show is bad in fact, the show is not the worst thing ever, nor is it even close to being the worst thing that I have or will ever review. Describing it best, this show is harmless, but that is for now, since, as I said, it only has 6 episodes at the moment, and depending on what I think about the next few episodes when they come out, the show could either get better, or it could end up getting worse. Thundercats Roar, for example, when the show's first 2 episodes were released online, I originally believed that it was in the category of just bad, since I did think that the first 2 episodes had problems with running gags in its animation. Then the next couple of episodes came out weeks later, and to me ranked the show from being just bad to awful. Or the opposite could be the case. I originally believed that both The Angry Beavers and My Life as a Teenage Robot were just good, but as I continued watching, I started believing that those shows were better and more interesting than I originally thought they were. But that really does depend. While I don't believe that Kamp Koral is nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, it's pretty underwhelming if I'm being honest with you guys. And no, it has nothing to do with the fact that Nickelodeon defiled Steven Hillenburg's wishes, even though that ended up being revealed to not be the case. Rather, It had something to do with the premise, the animation style that the show was going to use, and the choice in the cast of characters in the show. You see, when the show was first announced in June of 2019, it was revealed what characters were going to be in this show, that it was going to be set in a summer camp, and the fact that the show would include aged-down versions of the characters that we've seen in the original series. And this was all that I could think about when I heard about the first announcement for this show when it popped up. I was wondering, didn't we already just get 2 shows that were set in a summer camp and had aged-down versions of characters not too long before this show was announced? And how was this show going to work in 3D animation? All throughout the rest of 2019 and into most of 2020, the rest of the announcements for Kamp Koral were rather silent. Basically, kind of like a Thundercats Roar type of situation, where we would occasionally get a photo or preview of what the show is going to look like, but the show otherwise would remain a mystery. Up until we got a small preview of what Kamp Koral was going to look like at the end of 2020 in a promo for Nickelodeon's Wildcard game, where we see a few seconds of what Kamp Koral will look like, and my first thought was, I knew that the show being in 3D was going to be a major issue, and that particular I knew it realization made its way to the preview that we did get of the first episode, as well as when I got around to watching the actual show. And while the show's actual quality doesn't match the sync with the problems with the animation or even the continuity issues, since I surprisingly didn't have too many notable bad things to bring up with the show, 2 things did keep it down to the level that it is now. Kamp Koral revolves around younger versions of the characters from SpongeBob SquarePants and their wacky adventures at Kamp Koral, that is heavily implied to be a prequel to SpongeBob SquarePants, despite continuity issues that I'll be getting into in a little bit. These characters include SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Sandy as the campers, Mr. Krabs as the camp director, Pearl as the newborn baby, Mrs. Puff as the scoutmaster and activity teacher, and Plankton and Karen as the camp chefs. Going into this show for the first time, I was actually expecting this show to have a lot of problems, since as a SpongeBob spinoff / prequel, there were quite a lot of things that the show was going to do that weren't going to work, like the animation and problems with how the show tries to tell SpongeBob's origins. But after watching episode after episode after episode, I found that there were not too many notable things to comment on with this show. Oh, I think that this show definitely has problems without a doubt, but those issues that I have with this show are just salt on the open wound of what honestly would have been just a meh 5 out of 10 kind of show. In a way, the meh parts of this show kind of reminds me of what I thought of something like Smurfs The Lost Village, which I also didn't have a lot to comment on, except for the animation. Kamp Koral is kind of the same, but get rid of the animation part as a positive. Each episode that I've watched of this show falls into one of 3 categories. There are the episodes that are kind of annoying, the ones that raise a lot of questions, and the ones that I didn't have a lot to say about. They're just that. White noise. The animation in certain aspects did legitimately impress me, particularly the effects that they would use whenever SpongeBob or whoever else is on screen gets stung by jellyfish, but the rest of the series just feels empty of substance. Even in terms of entertainment value, it's perfectly in the middle with not a lot to say. It's not boring like I think that the Tom and Jerry comedy show or Alvin and the Chipmunks 2015 are, not as annoying as Thundercats Roar is, not as unpleasant as Ollie's Pack, not as infuriating as Robot Boy, and not as unwatchable as Kuku Harajuku. And it's not even really something that is enjoyable to watch because none of the things in the show sparks the enjoyable or interesting factor, which is what I thought about Nightmare Ned and Teacher's Pet. While I was able to watch all the episodes that are available of this show in one day and in one sitting, I got the impression of the episodes, aside from me saying eh, was just me kind of feeling bored. No, not the kind of bored where I end up having to watch something interesting afterwards to make me feel like I'm anticipating to do that thing again. unlike how I felt towards the Tom and Jerry comedy show and even how I felt about Alvin and the Chipmunks 2015. Instead, it's the kind where I was wishing that I was watching a completely different show instead, and to get watching the rest of the episodes out of the way quickly. This particular aspect alone would have probably given this show a 5 out of 10, since its sit-through kind of show where I was able to sit through the whole episode would give it a 5 out of 10. However, there's the other aspects of this show that are actually things that really hurt the quality of the entire show, and those things are the continuity and the animation. Starting off with the animation to get this right out of the way, when Kamp Koral was first announced, alongside some of the characters that they were going to bring onto the show, the announcement that the show was going to be done in 3D animation was actually one of my biggest concerns with this series. Unless you are Pixar or DreamWorks, 3D animation on television always had their disadvantages, since television animation is usually given a lower budget than that of theatrical animation. That's why William Hanna and Joseph Barbera went from the original MGM Tom and Jerry shorts in the 1940s and 1950s, when cartoons were theatrical, to the limited animation of the 1960s when television became popular and was being used. And the limited budget of anything animated also applies to 3D animation. Earlier CGI cartoons like Reboot and Beast Wars end up looking extremely dated when compared to how cartoons are now, and others would fall into the uncanny valley or have a frame rate issue. To be fair, the animation in some of these cartoons would be their weakest element, and they would be saved by the writing. Even with some of what I think are some of the better 3D animated cartoons like The Penguins of Madagascar or Miraculous Ladybug, the animation is their weakest element. The only times when 3D animation could get really good is if they have a huge company like DreamWorks working for them, or in things like Fanboy and Chum Chum, as bad as I think that show is, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2012. 2D and 3D animation have their own different ways of executing something. 3D is able to show every angle of a particular character, can add humorous things just like 2D animation, and can be technically impressive, but is much more limited with expressions, unless you want to leave it unpolished and horrifying. And 2D is able to exaggerate and make wacky faces without falling into the uncanny valley, and is able to do exaggerated movements and moments without everything feeling sudden or the viewers questioning if there were frames missing. And that's the exact problem that I have with the animation in this series. At every turn, all that could be asked is, why this show wasn't done in 2D animation. Maybe it was to make this show stand out from the original series. However, something that sounds like a good idea in your head could end up becoming poorly executed when you put it into a series. Because both 2D and 3D animation are meant to be used and consumed differently, at least in television. There are some things that I think that this show does well. For example, on paper, the character designs look good, and they luckily translated very well into computer animation. And as I said, I really was impressed by the show's effects, and some elements of things like the backgrounds are rendered fine. The problems start forming whenever exaggerated expressions and overly detailed marks make their way on screen. Hand-drawn animation is the best medium for exaggeration. They're usually the source of getting memes made out of. SpongeBob is one of the biggest examples of this. Heck, SpongeBob isn't even the only show that has memorable faces that were made. Ren and Stimpy helped popularize this, and OKKO did this quite a lot. In a 3D medium, this could very easily fall into the uncanny valley depending on if the character is well rendered or not. And this show has tons of moments where it does things like this and actually has a plethora of faces that could unintentionally come off as nasty looking or disturbing. The reason why the mouth extending larger than the face works in hand-drawn animation is because it's not as detailed as 3D animation, and you'd expect that the character would do that in that medium. And SpongeBob crying in the first episode looks very uncanny because of the looks on his eyes. And then there's the part in that same episode with SpongeBob being all stung, it looks absolutely horrifying. And that's because they're doing what the other SpongeBob series has done for years, and any hand-drawn animated show has done for years, by covering a character in pimples when that certain character gets stung or gets swelled up because of a major accident. They would do this to show that the character had an allergy side effect or got into an accident, or for comedic purposes. But the thing that this show doesn't really understand is that what looks comedic in 2D could become disturbing in 3D. And this show does the thing that the original SpongeBob series does by having the expressions go comedic way too much. And these particular expressions changes in a jump cut kind of way, and there's usually no smooth transition to some of these expressions. Whereas in things like 2D animation and other 3D shows of its kind, they animated faces going from one face to the other. I think I know why Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2012 often used 2D elements when it used the anime-esque faces, because those faces would be very difficult to animate when you're doing a 3D animated series. And the animation can also get very inconsistent. And I'm not talking about the expressions, which those are done for comedic purposes. No, when I say inconsistent, I'm talking about the animation quality of the show. There are several moments of this show where it goes from looking fully complete and standardly rendered for a CGI cartoon from Nickelodeon, to looking unpolished and not fully rendered, or looking incredibly fake. The biggest example of this is in the intro for the show, particularly with this frame. And the worst part of this is that this is the intro for the show. Flaws like this are going to be the viewer's first impressions of the show, that it looks like it came out of an early 3D video game cutscene. In fact, this screenshot right here looks like something out of Light's Camera Pants, which was released in 2005. And because a lot of the textures in this show look very unpolished, they end up looking very plastic, leading to the animation in this show becoming extremely unfinished, which also results in some of the expressions that this show does becoming even worse. When the preview for the first episode came out in January, one of the animators behind Kamp Koral said that Nickelodeon decided to release unfinished footage from the first episode, but after watching the first episode, as well as the other ones, I really don't believe that it's the case whatsoever. The show still looks unpolished and unfinished in certain parts, alongside the uncanny looking expressions. But the animation isn't the only problem with this show, and I don't even think that's the worst part of this show. No, that actually belongs to the continuity and how much this show retcons from the original series. Now, I understand that the original SpongeBob series is not really a show that has ever cared about continuity. The only thing that the original series cared about is making you laugh. And you know, that's completely fine. You could watch the original series in any order you want because it was episodic. Some of the continuity issues that the original series had was that the locations in which the characters would get to would always be changing or didn't have the other known building in the same shot. However, that's really the most that the original series did. The show still did have its characters stay consistent, and it didn't change the characters' origins constantly, and the show set up how the characters met. Something that this show did not take into consideration. I can understand why Patrick is in this show, since we didn't know how SpongeBob met him in the original series. Aside from one joke in the episode Secret Box, we don't know how SpongeBob and Patrick met, so I can understand Patrick being in this show. The other characters, however, I have several problems with. Now, I did say that not having continuity as well as not being good with it is fine, but there is a limit to that particular get-out-of-jail-free card. The original series was not that distracting with this problem since it had a plethora of jokes to keep you occupied with that instead of being distracted by the contradictions in that show. This one, though, does this with flying colors, to a point where it's distracting, and there's not even that many jokes to keep you distracted from the noticeable problems. which, by the way, the jokes in this show are not even that memorable or even noticeable, and some in particular go on for way too long. And the show also doesn't know about what makes something humorous. In the preview of the first episode that we saw, the joke was that Patrick was stalling for a long time to keep SpongeBob and the others from jellyfishing, and the literal punchline to this joke is Patrick being a hypocrite, which followed up with another joke that went on for way too long where SpongeBob was trying to catch a jellyfish while talking to his mom, and the punchline to that joke is SpongeBob's mom asking him if he caught his first jellyfish yet. And the show also believes that characters making wacky faces and being hyperactive equals funny. While sure, these particular things would make younger kids laugh, for those who are older, the jokes in the show easily fall flat on their faces. You know how the recent seasons of SpongeBob, seasons 9B to 13, usually get criticized for how their humor consists of wacky faces and all of that? Which I disagree about because there are actually other jokes in those episodes besides doing wacky faces. Well, that particular criticism that people launch at the recent seasons of SpongeBob is actually the case in Kamp Koral. Whenever a joke isn't killed by the fact that they drag on for way too long, they're just making distorted faces just expecting them to get a laugh with no situation of comedy happening around it. But getting back to the continuity problems, everyone has complained about how Sandy shouldn't be in this show, since SpongeBob already met her in the original series. And yes, that is a major problem that already retcons something that we knew about in the original show. Not only that, but Sandy herself is heavily flanderized in this show. She's basically just SpongeBob and Patrick in this show, meaning that in certain episodes like Tag Your It, she joins them in their shenanigans, when in the original series, she was more down to earth and was heavily into science, as well as karate, and usually stayed out of their shenanigans. I understand that Sandy is a bit younger, but this is just not consistent with her character at all. Next, let's talk about Squidward. I was originally going to let Squidward slide, considering the fact that, unlike Sandy, we didn't really know about how Squidward met SpongeBob entirely, unless you count the special Truth or Square where Squidward's garden gets ruined due to a pineapple falling on it. However, thinking about everything else, this is a particular problem that I need to address. Squidward is a lot older than SpongeBob in the original show. Considering the fact that in Truth or Square, there was a flashback where Squidward was working at the Krusty Krab while SpongeBob was a baby. And in the original Fry Cook, Squidward worked with Jim before he worked with SpongeBob, and from the looks on the flashbacks in that episode, it was set in the 70s, probably before SpongeBob was even born. So I have no idea how Squidward and SpongeBob could meet as children in the original show, when Squidward was already an adult when SpongeBob came into the world. Mrs. Puff and SpongeBob met in the original series in a flashback, and Mr. Krabs was heavily implied to be the oldest character in the original show besides the elderly characters. Heck, the original series specifically stated that Mr. Krabs was in the war, and Mr. Krabs opened up the Krusty Krab before SpongeBob was even born. And there are also other little things, like how Gary shouldn't even be in this show since we found out how Gary was adopted in the original series, and we got the origin of Krabs and Plankton and why they both hate each other and wouldn't work together ever again. This problem with consistency even expands to a lot of the writing decisions as well, and in one of these cases, the integrity got broken so badly that it spreaded a ton of questions both to this show and a little bit towards the original show in one particular episode. The episode Kitchen Sponge, and why exactly I think it's the worst episode of the show, at least at the moment. In this episode, Mr. Krabs forces Plankton to get some help from SpongeBob with the food sand to make the food more edible, so SpongeBob ends up making a ton of food that ends up becoming expensive, so he ends up making what would eventually become the Krabby Patty secret formula. Plankton has a realization that he could use this formula to take over the fast food world, but through a giant plot twist, we realize the reason why Sandy is in this show. This particular discussion about this twist is going to go into major spoiler territory, so if you don't want to be spoiled, click to the time code where I just talk about my big problems that I have with this episode, so you don't get majorly spoiled. So, near the end of the episode, Plankton takes a bite from the Krabby Patty that SpongeBob made and has a flash to the future where he could take over the world with him having a secret formula in his hands. Which results in a chase sequence where SpongeBob chases Plankton all across the camp until eventually, the formula ends up burning to ashes when Sandy brings a portable campfire to that spot on the camp. And through a huge plot twist, we find out that the reason why Sandy is in this show is because her future self sent her past self to summer camp. And if you're wondering, yes, because this episode decided to have a 2D sequence where we see Sandy talking to her past self, this is confirmed to be canon with the original series. This entire episode is a major contradiction to everything that the original series set up, and it raises so many more questions than not that I don't even know where to start. Okay, here we go. First question that I have, if Sandy was supposedly supposed to go to summer camp to prevent this whole thing, why wasn't Plankton already ruling the fast food world at the beginning of the original series? Going by this show's logic, in Help Wanted, Mr. Krabs' business would be in terrible conditions, since Kitchen Sponge implied that Plankton was ruling the fast food world by the time that SpongeBob met Sandy in Tea at the Tree Dome. Second question, didn't we already have an origin story about how the Krabby Patty secret formula was made in the original series? I mean, I know that Kamp Koral has entirely different writers and directors than those who have worked on seasons 4 and 5, but there is a way to proof check one of these episodes to see if something is going to contradict them or not. In the episode Friend or Foe, we got a backstory for both Mr. Krabs and Plankton and how they ended up becoming enemies. And we also found out about how the secret formula was made. It was made with the original ingredients on accident by Plankton, and when Mr. Krabs and Plankton started becoming enemies in the original series, they were also both kids. And in this show, they are both adults. So going by what the original series said, they should already be in rivalry with each other, considering the fact that this series is presumably set in their early adulthood. And third, and this is my biggest question of them all, how does SpongeBob know exactly how the formula is going to be made? In the original series, only Mr. Krabs knows about that, as said by the Sponge Out of Water movie, and SpongeBob forgets about the secret formula constantly in the original series. I was originally thinking about doing a review on this episode, and even talking about this show on Sean's Network Reviews, but I decided to abandon doing any other reviews on this show because there's barely much that I could say about this one. There's the obvious problems with how this show executes the animation and how it handles its continuity, but there's just nothing else to comment on. The show does have good-looking effects, and the show does at least put effort into trying to capture the feeling of the other SpongeBob series, unlike what the Tom and Jerry comedy show did, but the rest of the series is just white noise, at least at the moment. If you guys want to check out this series, it won't hurt if you actually do check it out. It's just that there are better shows out there. If you do want to watch this series, be my guest. However, if you do want to see much better shows than this, I would recommend watching Camp Lazlo instead, because Camp Lazlo is basically this show done better in every single way. It's entertaining, and at the same time, it does have notable things to comment on. It may not be as good as the other show that Joe Murray made, Rocko's Modern Life, but that show overall is fun, and while it does have certain similarities to SpongeBob, over time it ended up forming itself its own identity, and I would also recommend watching Summer Camp Island instead of this show too. Heck, instead of watching this show that ages down characters, watch A Pup Named Scooby-Doo and Tiny Toon Adventures, because they actually do interesting things with their premises, and they have enough comedy in them for you to not be distracted by the continuity. While I am going to be watching the rest of this series to see if it gets better or worse, For now, I think that this show would be a 5 out of 10 as a series on its own, since I didn't have too much to say about this show on its own, but a 4 out of 10 for two of the things added, both as a SpongeBob fan and someone who has seen that Nickelodeon can do much better things with 3D animation. In all honesty, if this is the approach that Nickelodeon decides to take with all of SpongeBob's other spin-offs, then it deeply worries me about what they're going to do with the Patrick Star Show, considering the fact that it's Patrick's family members that they're probably going to mess up the continuity for. Okay, so there's not much that I could say about Kamp Koral. What videos am I going to make next? My next 3 episodes of Sean's Network reviews on shows that are much more interesting to talk about. Goody! Back in 2021, I did a review of the first SpongeBob spin-off series, Kamp Koral. It was a series that I considered bad, but I decided to go ahead and say that it was bad for now. I ended up getting majorly sidetracked after I reviewed the show when it was brand new, from things like me focusing on shows like Power Players, Code Lyoko, and Kappa Mikey, to me getting burned out constantly and being overwhelmed, to the multiple hiatuses that this show in specific was given. Needless to say, I had bigger fish to fry than constantly keeping up with this show, because me being someone who does have memory problems, I didn't want to forget about any crucial elements from the shows that I was already reviewing / taking notes on, and I didn't want to sidetrack heavily in order to catch up on another series. And since by the time that this video is being scripted and or being put out, I might as well do this review. With this show officially being done now, I can give my final judgment on what I think of this show. Looking back at my original review on this series, it definitely shows its age, not only because at the time, only 6 episodes of this show were available, and I was only able to judge it based on what was out at the time, but at the time, I just moved into a trailer that was incredibly small, and there were constant issues that I was running into while trying to record the audio for the video,
such as with my dog barking,
as well as the fact that I was constantly feeling hot a lot of the time, and I had a lot of worries in my head at the time, such as things that happened in the same month, computer issues that resulted in me having to get a replacement computer in 2022, and the very small living condition that I was living with at the time. But now that I live in a bigger house, I don't need to worry about any computer issues anymore for a while, and I've had time to breathe and relax. And with me generally coming as far as I have with how I critique things, I can critique how this show is now with a more current lens. And what do I think of this show? Well,
it's a show about nothing. How do we know when it's over? I do.
Back during my original review on this series, I said that Kamp Koral is a series that I barely have anything to talk about because it hardly has anything of substance. And any and all substance that did happen in this show was how it was as a prequel to the original show. And guess what? The episodes after the 6th episode are no better. There are some episodes that I do like, admittedly, and so far in Sean's Network reviews, I stumbled upon a ton of shows that are worse and more frustrating, so this show is definitely not top 10 worst shows I reviewed material, but there is literally nothing new that I could say about this show than what I brought up back during my original review. Episodes 7 through 13, I did at least have something interesting to bring up about the show, but even then, there are things that aren't even unique to this show in particular. To recap, this show revolves around a young version of SpongeBob going to summer camp with younger versions of other SpongeBob characters, and that's literally all we get. Like, I understand that the original series had a very basic plot as well, that was basically a vehicle for the show to tell jokes, but like, there was something there in order to show the heart of the series and, you know, connect with the characters, like having SpongeBob work at the Krusty Krab, for example. Kamp Koral is literally the original show set in a summer camp, but you take away the heart and flavor that the original show had, and just do nothing as a result. The best way to sum up this show in a nutshell is that it feels like as if they're trying to do their own version of Camp Lazlo, because after all, the original series had similarities to Rocko's Modern Life. Let's do our own version of Camp Lazlo then. But Camp Lazlo at least has memorable characters, and they at least did things to distinct itself from Joe Murray's previous series. This show just wants to be in a summer camp because I don't know. It feels more like an obligation that they had to meet, rather than something that they wanted to do. So they just threw something random together. And it really shows, because the first major problem that I have with this show is that it's really boring. Currently, as of me reviewing various animated shows in Sean's network reviews so far, Kamp Koral is the third most boring animated series that I've reviewed so far, behind the Tom and Jerry comedy show, and a series that I've yet to rewatch for a review, Alvin and the Chipmunks 2015. This is literally a show where barely anything happens for 11 minutes, and any semblance of a plot is heavily overshadowed by them throwing in random garbage to fill up the runtime. It's literally just camp-related shenanigans that was done by much better shows, such as, for example, Camp Lazlo, which was at least able to tell a coherent story for each of its episodes, and had a cast of characters that were memorable. The only thing that this show does is that it uses characters from the original show that you could literally watch in the original show. The only thing that this show does is that it makes random side characters from the original show into reoccurring characters in this show, which is sweet, I guess, but that's not enough to make this show entirely different. And as such, this show feels as dry as SpongeBob is when he's on land. I mean, Gnarly Narwhal is an entirely new character made for this show, but I wouldn't say that she's a very good character. Her entire character trait is that she's just a plot device to force in conflict that didn't even need to be there. And what's more, is that she barely gets any consequences for whatever she does in the series. And even when she ends up making her way into the original show, the same ended up happening with Something Narwhal This Way Comes in Upturn Girls.
Yeah, full disclosure, I'm going to be talking about some elements of this show that made its way into the main show, because if episodes of Dexter's Laboratory that involve Dial-M for Monkey and the Justice Friends count as episodes of those shows, I'm gonna discuss episodes of the main series that involve Kamp Koral characters.
She does the exact same thing of starting conflict and gets no consequences for it. And in the case of Upturn Girls, she does things that get her and Pearl into trouble, like causing an innocent person to get hurt and ruining a pair of shoes, and she gets no punishment in return. In fact, Pearl flat out condones her actions at the end and insults Lady Upturn. Basically, this episode is the entirety of the lesson taught in Cars 2, but condensed into 11 minutes. It doesn't matter if you're not from the city, you need to be on your best behavior in a new environment. And like I said in my original review on this show, the retcons have not gone away, so there's nothing new to bring up there, though them having the characters breathe underwater just shatters what the original series did to pieces. The original series didn't acknowledge that they were already underwater for a reason, because in essence, that would be them questioning everything else about their world. They don't even do it as some sort of joke in this show, like what Life of Crime did. They outright did it in a straightforward manner, which just flies in the face of what SpongeBob is all about. Speaking of what SpongeBob is supposed to be about, what about the comedy? I gotta ask, what comedy does this show even have? It's just exaggerated faces and characters clumsily bouncing around the screen for 11 minutes. It's exactly what the post-sequel episodes get stereotyped as. This on its own is not inherently a joke. It's just characters doing things, and anything that they do end up doing that is effective, they end up running into the ground to the point where it's just not funny anymore. Squidward getting hit by a loose floorboard everywhere is not inherently funny. At least, not without a setup. And this show seems to put a lot more emphasis on toilet humor than the main show used to. There is a surprising number of jokes that involve diapers, as well as the outhouse. If the Patrick Star Show is the franchise's substitute for making more weird and out there episodes than the main show, then Kamp Koral is the franchise's home for the gross out jokes. I can tell that this show is written by an entirely separate team than the main show and the Patrick Star Show, because while this show was still ongoing, there were episodes of the main show and even the Patrick Star Show that were able to get a laugh out of me. Nothing is able to beat the first 3 seasons in regards to comedy, but something that the recent seasons excel at is that it's able to do visual jokes and slapstick very well. Ain't That the Tooth and Hot Cross Nuts are some of my favorite episodes in the recent seasons because of how they excelled at doing slapstick and adult jokes, especially the former, because unlike Kamp Kamp Koral, it actually does set up well to ensure that its jokes land. With Kamp Koral, I can't tell if it's even trying to be funny most of the time, though that might be because of how visually dull this series is. Speaking of which, I've gone on record saying that the animation in Kamp Koral is uncanny and inconsistent a lot of the time, but in watching the rest of the series in preparations for this review, I found another major problem with this show. This series has a very similar problem as Teen Titans Go.
By the way, you know who you are. Before you decide to whisper, overdone topic, I'm only bringing up Teen Titans Go as an example and an example only.
Not in the sense that the animation itself is similar. That would be comparing apples to oranges at that point. The problem that this show has in regards to its animation is that whenever the series doesn't look incredibly unpolished or horrifying, the animation in this series is just so bland. And the culprit of the problem in particular is with the backgrounds. The best way to sum up how dull that Kamp Koral, the location, is in this show is that this is straight up not a summer camp. Toll Drama Island, a show that was more about competition than camping, has a camp that looks more close to a camp than the one in this show. To describe the issue with the camp in this show looks like what happened in the Camp Laszlo episode Dirt Nappers, when Samson tried to clean the dirt all around Camp Kidney. He leaves a barren wasteland of nothing but dryness. In other words, the summer camp in this show is freaking boring. It barely resembles a camp at all. Instead, it looks more like a beach or desert than an actual summer camp. I get that this franchise is supposed to be set underwater, but not everything in the original series looked like a beach. The original series, for instance, had swamps that at least looked like swamps, and had forests that at least looked like a forest. And last I checked, Kelp Forest, which this series is presumably supposed to be set in, was covered by trees and is supposed to be darkly lit. And combining this with the fact that the color palette is incredibly washed out, makes the animation even more bland to look at. And no amount of exaggerated movements from the characters will be able to save the animation in the long run. I'm also not a fan of how they, instead of making 3D models for characters like the rest of Patrick's family, and the young versions of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, they just plastered the 2D versions into the show itself. Like, did they not have the money to make a 3D model or something? Like, even though, yes, these characters don't appear in more than one episode, that falls apart because Cecil Starr, as well as those burglars that appeared in some episodes of the main show, only have one episode in this show, and they had 3D models made for them, so that laziness here is inexcusable. Granted, the 2D animation of the characters is way better than the 3D animation, but still though. And whenever this show is not being a show about nothing, all they're doing is rehashing plots that we've already seen in the original, or they flat out make what happened in the original seem repetitive. Because you wonder why the characters don't stop and say in the original series, wait a minute, doesn't this whole situation look familiar? Like, I understand that the original series was known to have rehashed some of their episodes, even some post-sequel episodes have had this problem, and sometimes these rehash episodes are a lot better than the original episodes that they were copying off of. Hot Cross Nuts, for example, is a much better version of Krusty Dogs because things actually happen and there's more effort put into the adult jokes that it does. But with Kamp Koral, this just emphasizes the fact that this series didn't even need to exist. Because it's obvious that they were struggling to come up with episode plots, so they just resorted to throwing in whatever random garbage that they could put in, or anything that they did do, they just took from the original series and added absolutely nothing new to it. Like, no joke, there's literally an episode where SpongeBob makes Bubble Buddy, which results in the exact same results as the original episode, and 9 times out of 10, a lot of these rehash episodes are a lot worse than the episodes that they're taking from, or are just fine at best, but nothing special. Hill-Fu is basically Karate Choppers, but without Mr. Krabs intervening and threatening SpongeBob with the loss of something like a job. Night of the Living Stench is the Battle of Bikini Bottom with the roles reversed. Squidward is the one who wants to stay clean, while the other campers want to stay dirty. And the Jelly Life is basically Nature Pants. And other times, these rehash episodes bring in problems that weren't even in the episodes that they're copying off of. One such example being the episode Camp Cow, Cow, which is literally a direct ripoff of My Pretty Seahorse from the original series, and they didn't even try to hide it. The only differences are that the original episode is heartwarming, tells an actual story, grew a bond with SpongeBob and Mystery, and it's actually funny. Not to mention, that episode didn't have a running gag of characters wanting to step in horse droppings. This episode has exactly that with this sea cow that SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy befriends. It's a running gag throughout the episode that SpongeBob wants to step in it because it's considered lucky, but that's not funny. That's just disgusting. Especially when at the end of the episode, he kisses his shoe. And no, I'm not showing either the footage or a picture of him doing this. Note to everyone watching this video, don't step in cow droppings. You're not gonna get money out of it. All you're going to end up with is a shoe that is contaminated and needs to get cleaned immediately to prevent cross-contamination. This episode doesn't come close to either Foot Brawl or Robo-Monkey Shines from Robot Boy, but it's definitely up there. But that's the thing about Kamp Koral, and why I struggled to find that much to say about it. It has very little substance, to the point where I'm just bored most of the time. Which is very strange, because the main show and the Patrick Star show have so much more substance than this show. Even as late as season 13 of the main series, they were able to offer much more interesting things to talk about, for better or for worse. Even what I consider the worst episode of this show, Squizzery, is a Squidward torture episode with one of the worst twist endings in the entire franchise. But that's not even unique to this show, because the main series has tortured Squidward so many times that it just takes away this show's last chance to have anything unique about it. And many of the problems that I have with this show would just resort to me talking about things from the main series. This show even ends badly, starting off the series finale with camp being over, with the rest of the episode having SpongeBob and Patrick being left behind as they goof around for 22 minutes, then needing to stop these burglars, then SpongeBob and Patrick being taken back home on the bus at the end of the episode. Like, there is a plotline with SpongeBob finally trying to catch a jellyfish, but the episode has all of this buried within the storyline of these burglars hiding the golden jewelry they stole in pies. So, instead of ending the show with a heartfelt goodbye to the camp, they ended the series with the Mr. Krabs is cheap joke, where he deliberately tries to make Patrick throw up in a bag of money, because he ends up puking out the golden jewelry that he ate. Because if Camp Lazlo has to have a very bad ending with summer being over, this show has to have a bad one as well. And since I don't have any plans on doing a review on the following thing I'm gonna talk about, and since it's technically a Kamp Koral reunion episode, I might as well talk about the Creepaway Camp special from the main series. The episode was advertised in August of 2024, and Nickelodeon was hyping this episode up to the point of giving us a preview of what it had in store. I decided to go ahead and give it a watch when it came out, and I gotta say, I was absolutely disappointed with this episode. Not because of any sort of bias that I have with Kamp Koral. I mean, I'm able to separate any show that I don't like when being combined with the show that I like. For example, I still love the OKKO episode, Crossover Nexus, despite the fact that I don't like Teen Titans Go or Ben 10 2017. But even putting the Kamp Koral stuff aside, this episode is not good. For the obvious factor being that it's the first special of the show in a very long time that is literally nothing but a ratings trap. They haven't had a ratings trap on this scale since SpongeBob You're Fired, because the specials that were released after that episode at least delivered what they promised. Even Goons on the Moon delivered what they promised more than this episode. This episode in specific advertised itself as both a Kamp Koral reunion episode, as well as a Halloween special, and they only really delivered 1 out of 2 of the things that it promised. That being that, yes, it is a reunion episode, but the Halloween aspect of it is so underwhelming, because they build it up as something Halloween related, but they then trick the audience by revealing that Elwood, that very strange kid from Kamp Koral, decided to bring all of them deep into the woods for a reunion party, because as it turns out, he got left behind on the last day of camp before Kamp Koral was abandoned. Essentially, this episode shares the exact same problem as iParty with Victorious from iCarly, where this episode is incredibly surface level in regards to what it's trying to do. There are some jokes that did admittedly get a laugh out of me.
Unlike most episodes of Kamp Koral, SpongeBob is still able to get a laugh out of me with the recent seasons.
My favorite one being the sequence where it looks like Plankton and Karen are kissing, only for it to reveal that Plankton was just playing a video game. But other than that, the main problem with this episode is that barely anything happens. All the episode is in its basic form is the characters getting captured one by one before the reveal comes around and we have a reunion party. And when the episode came to an end when I first watched it, I was thinking to myself, wait, that's it? Before I immediately thought about the decision of what rating I'd give this episode. Admittedly, Season 14 was a very weak season, definitely the weakest of the post-sequel seasons of the main series, and out of every episode that came out of that season, while this episode is not the worst of them all, to me, those choices go to Sponge Chovy, Don't Make Me Laugh, Bassword, and Squidiot Box. This episode is easily the most disappointing out of all of them. But overall, as I stated in my original review on Kamp Koral, this show is harmless. It's still not a good show, for the fact that it's very pointless, makes retcons to the original series, and is very dull. But out of all the shows I have and will review so far, you can do a lot worse than this show. But that's the thing. A boring show is always going to be less fun to talk about than a show that is frustrating, because you can at least feel something while watching it. While watching Kamp Koral, on the other hand, the only thing I wish I could do is watch something that is much more entertaining than it.